Included in your order of service this morning, you may have discovered a two-sided insert. On one side is the responsive reading that we shared earlier, and on the other side is a statement of principles and sources of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. You don't need to take them out now, but you can take them home and put them on your refrigerator. These principles and sources were created with the input of Unitarian Universalists across the continent in the early 1980s and voted on by the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalists and entered into our bylaws at our association meeting in 1985. You can also find these statements, don't look now, in the front of the gray hymnal, on the internet, and on a tattered copy held by a magnet to the front of my refrigerator at home. It is there because it holds for me the best summary of everything I aspire to in all of my life. The closing line says, "Grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision." This has always been a compelling statement to me because it has served as a reminder to celebrate the many diverse theological perspectives that are embodied in our congregations. And there was a time when I simply used diversity and pluralism interchangeably. And then I was introduced to the work of Diana Eck, a professor at Harvard and one of the most notable advocates of religious pluralism in our country, who delivered a major lecture at the 2005 General Assembly. She said, "Pluralism is not an ideology, not a universal theology, and not a free-form theological relativism. Rather, pluralism is a dynamic process through which we engage with one another and, in and through our deepest differences. Pluralism does not mean abandoning differences, but holding in relation one to another. The language of pluralism is that of dialogue and encounter. In a world as it is today, it is a language we all need to learn." She said that in 2005, and it has never been truer today. It is, I would add, the language we need to learn if our congregations are to be places where we do not need to hide our differences in order to belong. It is a language that might make us better able to avoid dismissing or excluding the beliefs of others and might make us less conflict avoidant. The foundational language for pluralistic engagement is contained in our statement of principles and sources, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. We govern ourselves by a democratic process. Furthermore, we claim a religious tradition that draws from many sources, not from a single canon, but from an open canon that includes experiences of mystery and wonder, Jewish and Christian teachings, humanist teachings, and the wisdom of science and spiritual teachings of world religions and earth-centered traditions. The Unitarian Universalist Association has been very intentional and deliberate in the past few years with a number of initiatives which acknowledge diversity in sexual identity, a deepened understanding of race and class, that we may find commonalities that sustain us in a variety of relationships across otherwise culturally determined lines. This is a mere thumbnail sketch of the range of political, personal, theological positions that one might expect to find among our membership. Given all this diversity that we acknowledge and encourage and welcome, it would seem that Unitarian Universalist congregations would be hotbeds of pluralistic dialogue. By this I mean that as a matter of course, we would engage, as Eck says, in dialogue as practice that both enriches ourselves and others, involves mutual truth-seeking. The goal is not about total agreement. The goal is mutual understanding and the building of real relationships with others. Now, my observation is that it seems like we are all a good deal better at tolerating differences than we are about sharing and engaging and exploring them. This is a challenge because pluralistic dialogue is not really part of our dominant culture, and so requires time and discipline and intention. Unitarian Universalist congregations have come into being as a result of our claims of reason and acceptance of diversity. The special identity of our movement is in significant part dependent upon how we honor and grow from sharing our differences. This is really hard and challenging stuff. This is when I want to be a Presbyterian. Like living any faith, living a life as a believing Presbyterian, at least has a single canon that we can point to. We have a whole bunch of stuff, and it makes it challenging, because sometimes, as one of my new members said in a new member class, sometimes the garment of Roman Catholicism was too tight, but sometimes the garment of Unitarian Universalism is too loose. So I'd like you to engage with me for just a minute in an exercise that may illustrate my point about this difficulty. So if you are willing to do so, I invite you to close your eyes for just a second and imagine a small gathering that includes you and some others from this congregation. Maybe a coffee after Sunday service, or a friendship dinner, a newly formed covenant group, or an adult education class, where you are together with people to whom you feel attracted but don't know very well. I'm going to say a list of words, and I invite you to think about your own reaction and the reaction of others in your group to a statement that would imply, as new information, that one of you may be one or more of the following. Pay attention to your own reaction. Theist. Homosexual. Atheist. Pro-life. Homophobic. Christian. Homeless. Republican. Childless by choice. Do you think that there is a community standard in this congregation regarding these terms? If any of these terms applies to you, under what conditions might you choose to share that? What, if anything, might cause you to withhold that sharing? Would such a sharing move you closer to what you understand to be the community standard, or further away from it? Would such a disclosure encourage or discourage further disclosure? Under what conditions might you feel proud and safe to assert this aspect of your identity? How might your real or projected experience of reaction to these designations shape your sense of belonging? You can open your eyes if you're not asleep. I certainly have my own ideas about what the community standards are in most Unitarian Universalist congregations. We operate out of a set of assumptions about what are the characteristics of most Unitarian Universalists. We say we don't, but we do. They are the standards that seem to exist as common parlance. When in doubt, most of us are generally politically correct in an effort to appear both inoffensive and non-confrontational. This is the effect of creating what appears to be and often is, in fact, a safe context in which people feel they belong, wherever they are in their spiritual, emotional, political journey. This can be a good thing. Until that moment, when someone makes an offhand comment or tells a joke or pokes fun or is dismissive of a particular perspective that we all know everyone shares. We are a faith tradition that comes in all kinds of theological, political, affectional, relational, educational differences, so long as we don't know too much about it. Not talking about our differences can create the illusion of similarity and a lack of depth. We can come to assume that others think, feel, or believe as we do. When we are aware that the assumption of similarity is being made, we sometimes withhold our differences as a way of honoring the community standard or avoiding what we fear as confrontation. No discussion, no conflict. Or expressed in ways that are so unequivocal that there is no room for question. Well, since we're all liberal Democrats here, we react to a good deal more than we say, either because we don't care, don't want to rock the boat, or simply do not feel comfortable going against the cultural norm. And in so doing, we can sacrifice that depth. Though this may be inclusive, it can become a culture that actually discourages pluralistic dialogue, even when it can be appropriate or desirable. I raise this because I believe that there is a good deal of richness that we might be missing by settling for mere tolerance of diversity. I believe that we have the possibility of challenging ourselves to a deeper level of engaging each other as the pluralists that we claim to be. I contend that all theories succeed or fail at the interpersonal level, and that the practice of pluralism must begin in our families and our communities of faith. Unitarian Universalist congregations could be ideal laboratories for this kind of communication. So let's go back for just a moment to our imagined encounters of a few minutes ago and consider how you might engage one another as pluralists. Imagine that you consider yourself to be a humanist and find out that someone in your friendship dinner is a Christian who especially appreciates the numerous references in the service to God. Or you might not say out loud, "If I had known how many times there would be a reference to God in this service, I would probably have stayed in the car." Now, if you have been listening, you probably can identify that response as not really an entree into a pluralistic dialogue. But what might it be like to say something like, "I am interested in what about the use of God in our Sunday services when it happens is particularly meaningful to you. I consider myself to be a humanist. I left that language a long time ago, and I find the God talk to be especially awkward." This is probably part of a larger conversation. Could we get together for coffee sometime and talk about that? Now, I am sure that there are those among you who do this. I do, however, feel that it is safe to say, in a dominant culture that is right now built on sound bites and competition, where ambiguity and lack of absolute certainty is seen as weakness, this has become counterintuitive, even countercultural. It is so hard and challenging, like many worthwhile things. If we are to be more than a social club, claiming like-mindedness as a criteria for belonging, where we need to hide both our deepest held and fragilely formed belief, lest they create conflict or criticism, we may need to claim more fully the countercultural nature of our faith. Can we make room in all aspects of our life together for the colorful, painful, ambivalent, elegant aspects in our closets? Many windows, one light, many waters, one sea. All lifted hearts are free. Earlier in this service, I shared with you an excerpt from a sermon by the Reverend Marlon Lavenhar delivered at the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Earlier in the same sermon, he shared a story about his own deepened understanding of the complexity of our tradition. In 2008, the Tulsa, Oklahoma church where Lavenhar served welcomed into membership the bishop of a Black megachurch, along with several members of his congregation. This was not about the sharing of a particular theology, so much as a sharing of a deep commitment to the values expressed in our Unitarian Universalist statement of principles and the activist nature of our faith. But there was no hiding of the fact that these folks were informed by a spiritual practice that was Christian. So it was at least a great challenge to embrace and to integrate this sudden influx of unequivocal diversity. Lavenhar says it was well worth the challenge and risk because there have been so many great effects. 3 months after all this happened, a long-time white member of the church walked into my office one day. He is a staunch humanist, a lawyer, about 60 years old, and he said, "Marlon, I want to tell you something that I would have never told anyone in this church, and I never have. I grew up Pentecostal, and to this day, I still speak in tongues." Lavenhar says, "I tried not to look too surprised, but I was shocked, and I asked, 'How often?'" He said, "Probably once or twice a week." He described it as a kind of meditation that allows his mind to rest. Once I got over my initial disbelief and quietly checked my own prejudices, I was struck hardest by realizing that this is a central part of his spiritual life, and he has spent 30 years in our congregation and has never felt that he could tell anyone in our church without being judged negatively and maybe even to feel like an outsider. And he was right. I know because that was how I felt initially. Of course, he's the same intelligent, successful, rational, justice-centered man that I have always known. It made me bump up against my own prejudices. It was pretty stark condemnation of me and my community that he felt that he had to keep his truth, his spirituality in the closet in order to be welcomed into our church. These, I will say that these and many less radical possible practices do not get shared. Certainly not in the public sphere, but also not in the context of our churches. Instead of challenging the dominant paradigm of increasing polarization with curiosity about different perspectives, we can so quickly be drawn into the party line because our private thoughts have never seen the light of day for fear of strident challenge. We are not in the practice of quelling our defensiveness, avoiding leading questions, and suspending our judgments and projections, all parts of creating space for new insights. This practice is not for the faint of heart, but I think it is a practice without which we will never do much more than skim the surface, and in so doing, limit ourselves to easy answers to complex questions and deprive ourselves of deepening understanding of ourselves and each other. Stephen Rockefeller, a theologian and scholar, has written, "May we learn to trust that in the midst of all our diversity and disagreements, we are part of one human family and one earth community, that we are beings born for relationship, that we can grow as persons and find fulfillment only in and through creative communication and cooperation, even when we are deeply divided in our interests and goals. A pluralist believes that a wise person is open to learn from everyone, including our enemies." Well, I will say that I am certain that there are significant examples of pluralistic practice going on in this congregation. I witnessed such practice at our board meeting on Thursday night, in which we dealt together with some difficult issues in ways that were creative and elegant and respectful and deeply engaging. Upcoming challenges from our social action committee, our adult education practices and spiritual development opportunities serve to deepen our understanding of our unique and interconnected journeys. Conversations around how do we live our mission and the search for your new minister will undoubtedly continue to ask for deep listening and thoughtful responses. You will be better served to not be asking, will he or she be a theist or a humanist? But rather, will he or she be able to guide us into deeper conversation about our individual paths, to what supports and sustains our connection to each other, and to a larger mission and source of meaning. In a dominant culture that deals in sound bites, minute management, impulse buying, fast foods, quick fixes of every kind, the practice of pluralistic dialogue is fundamentally impractical. It takes time and commitment and leadership to create a culture that supports a spiritual and political depth. But the diversity that we as Unitarian Universalists invite holds within its tremendous potential to make our congregational communities laboratories for the very best and deepest and most loving kind of human discourse and disclosure. May it be so, because we are a covenantal people bound together by a sacred promise.